The last book in the Bible, Revelation, incorporates countless terms and phrases from the Old Testament. Understood together, the Old Testament and the book of Revelation reveal future events. For example, in Revelation 9:3, we learn of an army of locusts. The Old Testament says of these, the locusts have no king, yet go forth all of them by bands. The Midianites came up, and the Amalekites, and the children of the east, they came up as grasshoppers for the multitude. In Exodus, locusts were sent upon those that used force and oppressed God's chosen people. In 2 Chronicles, we learn that God sent locusts upon his own people when they go astray and do wicked things. If I shut up heaven, that there be no rain, if I command the locusts to devour the land. Thus the Old Testament reveal who, where, why, and what are the symbolic expressions used in Revelation in regards to locusts. In this way, the Bible is being employed to interpret the scripture itself, rather than utilizing personal speculation and one's own imagination to decide what it could mean. Several symbols from the sanctuary are also used in Revelation. So without any knowledge of God's law or the Old Testament, these symbols become very difficult to understand. So Revelation is always linked together with the books of the Old Testament. Now, the book of Ezekiel is one of the books which has profound similarities to the book of Revelation. On one specific point, type and anti-type can clearly be seen. The end of Jerusalem, just before its destruction as shown to Ezekiel, can be directly compared to the end time before Christ's second coming. Now let's look at some of them. In Ezekiel, 4 corners of the city, the end is come upon the 4 corners of the land. And Revelation, I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth. Back to Ezekiel, God's people is sealed before the destruction, and he set a mark upon the foreheads of the men. In Revelation, God's people is sealed before the end. Hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. Now back to Ezekiel, temple fills with smoke. Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub and stood over the threshold of the house, and the house was filled with a cloud, and the court was full of the brightness of the Lord's glory. Now to Revelation. Here we see the temple filled with smoke, and the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. Back to Ezekiel, plagues over the people, the sword is without, and the pestilence and the famine within. He that is in the field shall die with the sword, and he that is in the city, famine and pestilence shall devour him. Now back to Revelation. Plagues over the people. Revelation chapter 16 has 7 plagues mentioned. Back to Ezekiel, Jerusalem is destroyed. About 5 years after Ezekiel's vision, Jerusalem is destroyed. Back to Revelation, Christ's second coming and judgment upon the earth. After these end-time events is Christ's second coming. Looking at the two gives us a clue as to why the temple is filled with smoke. It gives no explanation in Revelation, but in the book of Ezekiel we see it signifying the Lord leaving the temple. Hence, the smoke in the temple in Revelation would therefore mean Christ is leaving the temple in heaven. From the book of Hebrews we learn that Jesus is ministering as high priest in heaven. Now of the things which we have spoken, this is the sum. We have such an high priest, who is set on the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. The Day of Atonement is when the high priest went into the most holy, and the most holy in the temple was filled with incense. The high priest went all the way to the most holy to make intercession for his people. Likewise, this is what Christ does in the most holy place in heaven. Wherefore in all things it behoved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he may be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. When the high priest left the most holy place, it had been determined who had humbled themselves before God and who had not. For whatsoever soul it be that shall not be afflicted in that same day, he shall be cut off from among his people. This act of cutting off someone from his people showed that the Day of Atonement was connected to a close of probation for the unrepentant sinner. So the plagues in Ezekiel consumed those who hadn't repented of their wicked ways, and God put a seal on those who had repented. Therefore, it is not unfair to assume that when the temple is filled with smoke in the book of Revelation, it signifies the close of probation. Christ is no longer mediating with his atoning blood on behalf of the sinner. This is just what happened in the type in Ezekiel. The Shekinah leaving the temple signified a close of probation. Son of man, seest thou what they do? Even the great abominations that the house of Israel committeth here, that I should go far off from my sanctuary. Therefore will I also deal in fury, my eye shall not spare, neither will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, yet will I not hear them. It is noted here that although they do address him, he will not hearken to them. Thus, it is a clear close of probation for them. Right before Christ returns and has left the temple in heaven, he says, He that is unjust, let him be unjust still, and he which is filthy, let him be filthy still, and he that is righteous, let him be righteous still, and he that is holy, let him be holy still, and behold, I come quickly. So if a sinner doesn't repent, the probation is closed for him. Consequently, the time of probation is only there as long as Christ is in the temple, pleading for our lives. But why has the end come? What is it that has made the citizens of Jerusalem go too far? And is there a parallel with the end times, like the book of Revelation has shown us? Well, let's look. Buy and sell. The last 1.5 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, the people were besieged by the Babylonians, making it impossible to buy and sell. This strategy was used to force them to surrender. Similarly, we see a symbolic Babylon resurface in the book of Revelation that is cooperating with the beast. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. And so those not yielding to the will of Babylon will in both cases lose the ability to buy and sell. Moreover, it is worth noting how the people inside the city of Jerusalem worship the Babylonian gods alongside the God of Israel. Thus the nation about to conquer them is the same nation whose gods they have already accepted and worshipped. The same situation occurs again in the last days, and God is giving his people one final warning. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues, for her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. And let's have a look at the image and the mark. The image, the greatest sins, except cruelty against the poor, the fatherless, the widows, and the shedding of blood. Except from this, the greatest sin that caused God to leave Jerusalem and allow it to be destroyed are described in Ezekiel. God takes Ezekiel to Jerusalem by vision and show him two things. The first is an image. And he put forth the form of a hand, and took me by a lock of my head, and the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven, and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the inner gate that looketh toward the north, where was the seed of the image of jealousy, which provoketh to jealousy. In the book of Revelation, we also learn of an image, namely the image of the beast, and that if we follow it, we will be destroyed with the rest of the world. The power behind the image will try to kill those who do not obey it, and thus God's people will have to make a dramatic choice. Either stand for God, but be persecuted by man, even until death, or suffer the punishment of God, which is also unto death. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Now, what does the image in Ezekiel teach us about the image in Revelation? Well, we know that the north gate is where the sheep were brought into the temple, the sheep gate. But perhaps many are unaware that the gates in biblical times were connected with city administration. The gates usually contained several rooms. Archaeology shows us this in the city of Hazor and in the city of Gezer in the time of Solomon, among others. It was also common to have set places outside the gates where traders came to sell their goods to the inhabitants of the cities. Inside the gateway, too, a space was left without buildings. This served as a communal area and public justice area. Just inside the gate at dawn, there is raised dais that had provision for a canopy to be erected. This would have served for the judge's throne. So the gate served as sort of town hall. This is confirmed by the prophet Amos, who states, "They hate him that rebuketh in the gate, and they abhor him that speaketh uprightly. And hate the evil and love the good, and establish judgment in the gate. It may be that the Lord God of hosts will be gracious upon the remnant of Joseph." Also in the story of Lot and Absalom, we see the custom where the administrators and judges sit at the gate. The prophecies of Jeremiah, concurrent with Ezekiel, show the same. When the princes of Judah heard these things, then they came up from the king's house unto the house of the Lord, and sat down in the entry of the new gate of the Lord's house. Then spoke the priests and the prophets unto the princes and to all the people, saying, This man is worthy to die, for he hath prophesied against this city, as ye have heard with your own ears. Notice how they are declaring that Jeremiah should be killed. And here we have a connection where we see God's people receiving a death sentence at a gate. A gate is also where an image is. Now, another time he was judged, the sentence was executed at the gate. Then Pashur smote Jeremiah the prophet and put him in stocks that were in the high gate of Benjamin, which was by the house of the Lord. And so, when God sent Jeremiah a message to give to the people, he sent Baruch to read it at the same gate. Then read Baruch in the book of the words of Jeremiah in the house of the Lord, in the chamber of Gemariah the son of Shaphan the scribe, in the higher court, at the entry of the new gate of the Lord's house, in the ears of all the people. In Jeremiah 39:3, we learn that even the highest official, the king, sat at this gate. Now when Ebed-melech the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs which was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon, the king then sitting in the gate of Benjamin. A little before he found the king sitting in the gate, the priests and leaders had come to the king with the following request. Therefore the princes said unto the king, We beseech thee, let this man be put to death, for thus he weakeneth the hands of the men of the war that remaineth in the city, and the hands of all the people in speaking such words unto them, for this man seeketh not the welfare of the people, but the hurt. Then Zedekiah the king said, Behold, he is in your hand, for the king is not he that can do anything against you. So the people appealed to the king, who actually feared them, to execute a death penalty on God's faithful, in order to silence him. In this way, the religious leaders asked the government to persecute on their behalf. It is exactly the same as when Christ was killed, and what the papacy did during the Middle Ages, cooperating with the kings in Europe. When the army of Babylon came and took the city, they instantly sat where the judges and rulers of the city were to sit. And all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate, even Nergal-Sharzar, Samgar-Nebo, Sarshashim, Rabsaris, Nergal-Sharzar, Rebmag, with all the residue of the princes of the king of Babylon. Once they did this, Zedekiah admitted defeat and fled. And it came to pass that when Zedekiah the king of Judah saw them, and all the men of war, Then they fled and went forth out of the city by night, by the way of the king's garden, by the gate between the two walls, and he went out the way of the plain. In the time before the destruction of Jerusalem, the tribe of Benjamin lived in the area north of Jerusalem, so the north gate may very well be the gate spoken of. This is strengthened by Ezekiel's vision, where they could, at the time he saw, have changed the governmental seat to the north gate from another gate. My opinion is that it was the same place. Graven images were everywhere, and so this couldn't be the only sin. However, if the place was an administrative or governmental seat, it makes it perfectly understandable that God could no longer tolerate it, especially if this governmental seat was used to persecute his messengers. Now, the seat of the image of jealousy, what could it mean? Why is God jealous? In the law of God, we learn that God is jealous when his people obey the laws of other gods or the religious practice of the heathen. Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God and serve him, and shalt swear by his name. You shall not go after other gods of the people which are around about you. For the Lord thy God is a jealous God among you, lest the anger of the Lord thy God be kindled against thee, and destroy thee from off the face of the earth. You shall diligently keep the commandments of the Lord your God, and his testimonies, and his statutes, which he hath commanded thee. The Ark of the Covenant was God's earthly throne, and it contained his law. If we look at 2 Thessalonians, we see Paul warning us against a deceiving power among the believers who opposed and exalted himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Again, we see the same in Daniel, that when someone changes or go against God's law, they are in competition with God, and thus would make God jealous. And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. Now, the word God in the Bible is also used to describe judges or high officials who manages the law. So if someone is sitting in the temple of God showing himself that he is God, well, God dwelled over his law in the ark. It's the law that gives someone authority to judge, and so God sits as a judge in his temple. That's why they brought animal sacrifices into the temple to atone for sin. Sin is breaking the law. So someone copying God is sitting as a judge, judging people after the law he represents. As we see in the Bible, that if the judges represent God's law, they are in favor with God. But if the judges and rulers represent and rule after a conflicting law or a competing law, they are in competition with God. They oppose God's right to determine right from wrong. They opposeth him. But you can say many countries does this. Even Babylon, who God used to punish Israel, had a conflicting law. Why was Israel's action considered to have gone too far? And how does it relate to the end times? In this case, we see that the seat of the image of jealousy is not only by the temple, it's at the entrance to God's temple. And here comes the great deception that made God have to interfere. Up until this time, the sanctuary service had continued, but in a corrupted way, and the animal sacrifices were usually taken through the north gate. To the door of the inner gate that looketh towards the north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provoketh true jealousy. The seat is a place of authority and an image of jealousy to God. Though Jeremiah, he had repeatedly told them to listen to him at the gates, but they had rejected his authority in favor of another, and thus the word jealousy. At this time of the close of probation for Jerusalem, they had placed their loyalty to the government, who in return had chosen by law to favor a corrupt religious system. We also learn from Ezekiel that an image of Tammuz was at the north gate. Tammuz supposedly went to the underworld and was resurrected, but he was a false Messiah, imitating the future mission of the true Messiah and corrupting the true gospel. He was also a shepherd and a king, and in this way, this God was stealing God's titles right in front of his children at the very entrance to God's temple. But Tammuz wasn't represented himself, only an image of him. The sentence, "Where was the seat of the image of jealousy," therefore shows an unification of the governmental seat and the false shepherd, a state taking sides and judging in favor of a corrupt religious system. Tammuz had a similar story as Messiah's mission, death and resurrection. If we continue with our comparison here, the governmental powers, which is the beast in Revelation 13, will give their authority to honor a false Christian system, which might be why they are called the false prophet later in Revelation. Jeremiah, however, who was a true prophet sent by God, was punished and judged at the gate, which again shows governmental persecution against the faithful and loyalty given to the false. The book of Revelation reveals that there will be false prophets in the end time, who will work with the beast and the dragon himself. The Antichrist is someone appearing like Christ or imitating Christ and stealing his titles. For many centuries, the leader of the biggest Christian denomination has done just that, claiming to be the vicar of Christ with the authority that comes with it. He claims to be a king among Christ's followers and their shepherd and their high priest. It's important to note that the image at the north gate was an imitation of Christ. Again, Tammuz was famously portrayed as a shepherd, the one who guards the flock. Just like Tammuz, they have a shepherd's rod in their hands. It's also worth noticing that God's people had at this time rejected the pure truth that He had given them directly, as well as their task to represent Him to a corrupted and falsified version of truth that was more accepted in the world. And thus, in a way, God's people at the close of their probation had chosen the religion of the masses. They had adjusted their belief to gain economical advantages, popularity, and recognition from the world. In the same manner, many people face the same temptations today, letting go of truth for the sake of acknowledgement and recognition in the world or acceptance in ecumenical gatherings. Thus, the first thing shown in Ezekiel at the close of probation was unification between the state and a false religious system, leading to the persecution of God's faithful. The next element is the result of their corrupted worship, and that's the mark. In Revelation, the image is found alongside with the mark. If any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God. We also learn who will not worship the beast, his image, or receive his mark, because they are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Do we see obedience to God versus obedience to another power in Ezekiel? Well, inside the gate with the image of jealousy, Ezekiel was shown the leaders of the people. And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their back towards the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they worshipped the sun towards the east. Again, we see the leaders that represent the state or government showing worship and obedience to the sun god. Now notice that while they were worshipping the sun towards the east, at the same time they had to turn their backs on the temple of the Lord. Now what's inside the temple? The law of God. Consequently, they turned their backs on God's law while worshipping the sun. This act also shows what is happening today, only less overtly. In the Bible, worship is always linked to obedience. This means that in both cases there is a choice of turning one's back on God's law and follow that of a pagan god, or obeying God, and these men of God chose to turn their backs on God's law. The Babylonian sun god Shamash was the god of law, justice, and salvation. And so, when the leaders bowed before the sun with their back turned away from God's law, they were choosing the justice and law of the sun god before God. Their decision became the close of their probation, and Christ left the temple, and Jerusalem was soon destroyed. So the image is a false religious system using the state to advance their agenda and punish those who do not follow it. And the mark is a mark of authority. Just like God says obeying him is a sign that we worship him. The mark or sign of who we worship or serve is our actions. When the leaders bowed before the sun representing another law and order, this action marked where their loyalty was. Those who refused by their action showed God was their ruler. In the Bible, God told his people to put his law on their forehead and on their right hand as a sign, so they would remember to keep it. But in Revelation, we see those who follow the beast have his mark on their foreheads or hands. So the beast has marked the areas that were to remind God's people to be loyal to his law and placed his own mark there instead. This is what we see take place in Ezekiel. Leaders and lawmakers are favoritizing a corrupted version of the truth. The religious leaders convince the government to judge and sentence people on the basis of religious questions. They turn their backs on God's law to obey and worship another lawgiver, the sun. They show loyalty towards the false religious system before God. This can truly be said about the Christian world today. They have allowed themselves to be convinced and fooled into thinking that they are not sinners when they break God's law, and so they are still in captivity. Because the law is still condemning them as lawbreakers, and they don't seek pardon for their sins, because they claim they have not sinned when they broke the law, and so they are still in conflict with the law. And sin has been given a new definition to the breaking of whatever their own rules and regulation that differ depending on what church you go to. Jesus said, "Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandments of God, you hold the tradition of men." Christ's frustration is the same we see throughout the Old Testament. "And why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say?" And he said, "Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, ye that work iniquity." The word iniquity is the Greek word anomia, which literally means violation of law. He's speaking of those who claim to worship him while they are teaching men to violate his law. The mixture of truth and lies is insulting and causes God more grief than anything else. Imagine if you came to a hospital to get help and instead they inflict you with a deadly virus. After that, people would fear to come to the hospital for healing. This is why it's such a serious matter. The book of Revelation was written to God's people, and the dangers they were facing and corruption among them was the biggest danger of them all. The same we see in the time of Ezekiel and the first temple destruction. The corruption was at the entrance to God's temple, the unfaithfulness right in front of the temple. Those coming to worship God had to go through the gates of corruption, and once inside, witnessing the mixture of paganism and true religion once again. God called it an abomination, and the very reason he could stay no longer and would leave the temple and allow Jerusalem to be destroyed. And many Christians are no different today. They follow the ways of the heathen, they take part of the immorality of the world, they commit adultery and fornication just because it's the norm of society to do so. They do idol worship, not only icons and saints and worldly religious festivals, but also modern superstars and heroes. And they have rejected God's law as old-fashioned and outdated, yet claim they represent God in their communities. But the warning in Revelation 18 is that we will perish with the world if we partake in the sins of the world. Part of the reason for the destruction of God's people was these, and you shall know that I am the Lord, for ye have not walked in my statutes, neither executed my judgments, but have done after the manners of the heathen that are around about you. The day the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem was on the 10th day in the 10th month of the biblical month. God's people would be subdued under Babylon and their successors for a long time. Interesting enough, the day the ark below Golgotha was rediscovered was the same day, the 10th day of the 10th biblical month. This might be a signal that the siege of Babylon is about to be lifted for good by the king of the Ark. It could be, and I think it's an interesting thought. Now let's take a look at the years before the destruction of Jerusalem. Approximately 35 years prior to Jerusalem's destruction, something extraordinary took place, which may also be symbolic of the time before the second coming of Christ, and what takes place is related to the Ark of the Covenant. And it came to pass in the 18th year of King Josiah that the king sent Shaphan the son of Azaliah the son of Meshullam the scribe to the house of the Lord, saying, Go up to Hilkiah the high priest, that he may sum the silver which is brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the door have gathered of the people, and let them deliver it into the hand of the doers of the work, that have the oversight of the house of the Lord. And let them give it to the doers of the work which is in the house of the Lord, to repair the branches of the house, unto carpenters and builders and masons, and to buy timber and hewn stone to repair the house. The ark wasn't present in the temple at this time. In fact, it was hidden away. But Josiah had decided to do that which was right and started to renovate the temple. It's because of his willingness to do this that the Book of the Covenant is discovered. This illustrates perfectly how our willingness to go forth and do a work of reformation for God's church can actually bring forth blessings we didn't know of. The king is willing to start a reform, but didn't know what God really required, so God rewards the king's zeal and the knowledge he is missing. And Hilkiah, the high priest, said unto Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. And Shaphan the scribe showed the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest hath delivered me a book. And Shaphan read it before the king. And it came to pass, when the king had heard the words of the book of the law, that he rent his clothes. King Josiah reacted the best way possible. He realized they had broken the covenant God made with them, and they were in fact in terrible trouble, as the punishment written in the book was to come upon them. He asked God what to do, which is another correct approach. This bought Jerusalem more time. We are told, Thus says the Lord, Behold, I will bring evil upon this place and upon the inhabitants thereof, even all the words of the book which the king of Judah hath read, because they have forsaken me, and have burnt incense unto other gods, that they may provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands. Therefore my wrath shall be kindled against this place, and shall not be quenched. But the king of Judah, which sent you to inquire of the Lord, thus shall you say to him, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, as touching the words which thou hast heard, because thine heart was tender, and thou hast humbled thyself before the Lord, then thou heardest what I spoke against this place, and against the inhabitants thereof, that they should become a desolation and a curse, and hast rent thy clothes, and wept before me. I also have heard thee, said the Lord. Behold, therefore, I will gather thee unto thy fathers, and thou shalt be gathered into thy grave in peace, and thy eye shall not see all the evil which I will bring upon this place. And they brought the king word again. It seems like Jerusalem's end was to come during the king's reign, but now it had been delayed. King Josiah still wanted to do all he could, and he began his reform. The first thing he did is that he re-established God's feast days in the kingdom and removed the paganism, doing everything he could to stop idol worship. Then he placed the Ark of the Covenant back into the temple, and said unto the Levites that taught all Israel, which were holy unto the Lord, Put the holy ark in the house which Solomon the son of King David, king of Israel, did build, and it shall not be a burden upon your shoulders. Serve now the Lord your God and his people Israel. King Josiah had been told he could not save Jerusalem from destruction, but he knew he could still save a large number of people. The reply from God that we just read was in response to the message Josiah sent through the high priest to God, Go inquire of the Lord for me, and for them that are left in Israel and in Judea, concerning the words of the book that is found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is poured out upon us, because our fathers have not kept the word of the Lord, to do after all that is written in this book. Perhaps because of the work Josiah started, some of the inhabitants of Jerusalem remained loyal to God even when they were taken captive to Babylon, like Daniel. This all took place approximately 35 years before Jerusalem was destroyed, and therefore less than 35 years before the city was besieged during his son's reign. The great Reformation Josiah accomplished had an effect on many, but not all. Shortly afterwards, the idol worship was back in the temple court, like we read in Ezekiel. Now I want to make some comparisons to our time. Could the rediscovery of the Ark bear a resemblance to the time before Jerusalem's destruction, just like its destruction resembled the destruction of the world at Christ's second coming? It's interesting to note that Ron Wyatt discovered the Ark of the Covenant in January 1982. That is now 35 years ago. If it will be the same time is of course impossible to say, but the resemblance between the Ark discovery before Christ's second coming and the Ark resurfacing before the destruction of Jerusalem is notable. Why wasn't the Ark discovered 100 years ago, or 200, or 1,000 years ago? The fact that it was found only about 35 years ago could be a sign that something is about to take place soon. And where else to find the answer to such a discovery than to look at similar reappearances of the Ark in the Bible and what it meant back then? If we are to continue the comparison, then who ordered the temple to be renovated in the first place? It was the king. What was the result of the king's plea to God for the sake of the people? It was that the time of trouble was pushed further into the future. An additional time of mercy. During this time, God's people who had become one with the customs of the world were called upon to repent and reform. They had in large part taken part in the worldly ways, and the Ark with God's law was ignored by the majority. And although God had given them a chance to get to know His law all over again by the discovery of the Book of the Covenant and read aloud to the people, and by having the Ark resurface, they chose to turn their backs on the Ark and God's law and follow the laws of the pagans. When God has laid everything in the open and made sure that everyone was tutored in His law and they still didn't want to listen, then there was nothing more God could do. They had rejected Him as king. If this is the scenario that will take place before the earth's destruction, that God will make His law known again and even bring out the evidence to show the world, and His throne is rediscovered with the king's blood on the mercy seat, and man choose to obey a conflicting law enforced by the beast power, then there is nothing more God can do. Men have chosen. Jesus is our king and our high priest, and in the story of Josiah, it was the king and the high priest that went to God on behalf of the people. Christ would have seen the state of the church of Laodicea, the worldly ways and busy lifestyles, partaking of the sins and the amusements of the world, and wouldn't He recognize the desperate state as they were about to enter the time of trouble and make a special plea to God? Could the resurfacing of the Book of the Covenant and the Ark of the Covenant right before Josiah's plea be symbolic of how the Ark of the Covenant would be found at a time when Christ would make a special plea? Could this work our high priest and king is doing on our behalf have been given him by God to be granted a little more time before the destruction comes and all hope is lost? Did Christ plea for the world and for His deceived people to gain Him some more time? A time that perhaps was already over? Was the time that the door of mercy was open to His church prolonged? And did His zeal to save and cleanse His people result in God bringing the Ark back into history as a warning, an example, and to lead people back to Him? If we do draw comparisons between the discovery and the only story in the Bible that speaks of such a revelation before an imminent destruction, then the time we are living in now might have been given because of Christ's special intercession on our behalf. Now let me explain why I make this comparison. The people in Judah did not receive atonement if the ark wasn't in the sanctuary for the high priest to sprinkle the blood upon it on the great day of atonement. Therefore, the fact that the ark was placed back into the temple meant that the high priest could intercede for the people a little while longer. But just over 30 years later, the ark was removed again because of their sins, and the high priest could no longer visit it with the blood of the sacrifice. So every year from when the ark was placed back into the temple, they witnessed God's endurance and patience. But the extra time of mercy and the service of the high priest only lasted for a short period, and the city's destruction still took place within a relatively short time. Although it took only about 35 years in the Bible story from the Book of the Covenant was found, and the priest was given a prolonged time to intercede on behalf of the people till the city was destroyed, we cannot make a perfect comparison with the end time, because the Bible clearly states about the second coming, but of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. So please bear in mind that this is not an attempt to time-set Christ's second coming. We are just looking at the similarities between the two stories and what we can learn from it. If the two stories can be compared, then the discovery of the ark is a sign and a gift from God to Christ after his plea to help us right before the end of time. Perhaps the angel's warning for us to separate from the sins of the world is actually given as we speak to the people's hearts to hurry out of that which they have been partakers of and get ready before it's too late. If the time was prolonged, then I am one of those who was called upon as a result of God's mercy, as would many others be who came to Christ after the ark was rediscovered. If these stories are comparable and given by God to reveal that the ark's discovery really is by him, we must see how great a work Christ our King is doing for us every day. Perhaps also see that many of us are saved at the last minute, so to speak, in a prolonged time of mercy, and give great thanks. I want to emphasize that I have no way of knowing or saying how much time the world has left. Jesus might make another plea and the world will continue even longer. It's not been given man to know the date, but those who are thinking it's been a long time since the ark was found and still nothing has happened might realize that it hasn't been any longer than God took in the story of Josiah, and maybe contemplate that the wait is actually a sign of mercy. Thank you for listening, and God bless.